We are all close with someone who is grieving horrific property losses and devastating displacements, and 5 lives have been lost in these fires. In my own family, we have a house full of evacuated family members camping out in every room of our home. Our hearts are with all of those who've been displaced and with the thousands whose homes have been destroyed. Welcome to Dr. Anthony Fauci. We are so honored to have you with us tonight. So glad that you have recovered from the devastating West Nile virus. Thank you for making time for us. And for those of you who have not yet read Dr. Fauci's memoir, I highly recommend it. We have a link to the book in past emails, and it will be in the chat tonight and in the email we send right after tonight's program. Thank you as well to our beloved moderator, Patt Morrison. Next week, we will welcome Ambassador Dennis Ross of the Washington Institute. This will be our Israel in Crisis program number 20. This week, after next week, we will have the presidential inauguration, as you all know. And that week on Wednesday night, we will have Jeffrey Goldberg, editor-in-chief of The Atlantic, who will be with us in conversation with Madeline Brand on the topic of Inauguration Week, where are we headed? It's a good question. Maybe he can help us figure that out. Before we start tonight's program, I wanted to repeat that our hearts are with those whose lives are being turned upside down from the terrible fires in Los Angeles. We pray that they will end soon and they'll be contained. And we, of course, thank our firefighting teams who are out there trying to save property and life. Now, to introduce our most esteemed guests and moderate tonight's discussion, please welcome Patt Morrison. Pat is a writer and columnist for the Los Angeles Times. She has a share of 2 Pulitzer Prizes for her work hosting radio programs on public TV and radio. She has received 6 Emmys and a dozen Golden Mikes. She is a superstar to whom we are very grateful for agreeing to serve as one of our regular America at a Crossroads outstanding moderators. Pat, the program is yours.
Thank you, Janice. Thank you, too, to everyone who is joining us tonight. Difficult circumstances in Los Angeles, but it's been so important over many years to hear the voice of Dr. Fauci, Dr. Tony Fauci, as he thinks of himself, physician, and especially perhaps now. Dr. Fauci is a physician and immunologist who spent more than 4 decades in public service as director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, which is part of NIH. He served 7 presidents through the HIV/AIDS pandemic, several variants of flu, the Ebola and Zika infections, the 9/11 anthrax attacks, and most recently, of course, COVID. For his work on the AIDS relief program known as PEPFAR, President George W. Bush awarded him the Presidential Medal of Freedom. His book, as you saw, is called On Call, A Doctor's Journey in Public Service. What you may not know, however, is that his name has appeared on donuts and socks and bobbleheads and fan mail and maybe fan clubs. And he was played by Brad Pitt on Saturday Night Live in a spoof. And the documentary, Thank You, Dr. Fauci, has a 94 rating on Rotten Tomatoes, which is better than Gladiator. To the other side, he has gotten, along with his family, vile emails and even death threats. Trump advisor Steve Bannon has said he should be beheaded and his head put on a pike outside the White House. He's endured endless hostile questioning, a lot of it from members of Congress, and he has been called by some a murderer, including by anti-vaxxers, for his pro-health and pro-awareness policies. Dr. Fauci, we are so honored to have you with us.
Thank you very much, Pat. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you.
The origins of the public health service in this country go back more than 200 years. But let's say the patient is the American public health care system right now. So do a diagnosis of public health in this country right now. Symptoms, prognosis, how are we looking?
Well, right now, we're certainly better off than we were a couple of years ago, as we all have suffered through one of the most extraordinary, devastating pandemics in over 100 years. So a few years ago, the public health of the United States and of the world in general took a very serious blow. Right now, hopefully, we will recover and look forward to the coming years better prepared for the kinds of things that devastated us over the previous few years. As you know, we're now, Pat, in our 5th year of COVID. The number of cases are dramatically lower than they were. So it isn't the kind of extraordinary stress on society that we have seen several years ago. So my hope as a public health person, as a physician, as a scientist, is that we've learned lessons from this. And as we go forward, there will be other outbreaks. I mean, history has told us that many times there will be other outbreaks, and hopefully we'll be better prepared for them.
We're taking your questions for Dr. Fauci. We'll put them to him a little later in the program. You can put them in the Q&A box and we'll sort them out and try to group some together if they're thematically the same and get to some different ones. Just so you know, though, Dr. Fauci won't be answering questions about the nominees for the new administration and the new cabinet, but there's an awful lot to talk about his serving 7 presidents and his service to and his relationship with Donald Trump. That was a chapter called Love Me Not in his book, which I found to be very engaging. One of the things that comes through in your book is that as a country, we don't understand very well how science works, that science isn't just presenting us with an answer with a bow on it, that science is a process. And some of the accusations that members of Congress came up with were, well, he told us not to wear masks, then he told us to wear masks, and then he said this and that, and it was grossly misleading. Is this something that people have put their faith in science, especially medical and biological science, without really understanding how it works?
I think you put your finger right on it, Pat. It's understandable but unfortunate lack of full appreciation of what the scientific process is. Science is a process that allows you, at least in the biomedical sciences, to gather information, data, and evidence that will allow you to make recommendations or guidelines or suggestions to preserve the public health. When you're dealing with a moving target, the way we dealt with over the years that we had the real intensity of COVID from the very beginning of 2020 right through the next few years, that we were getting new information, and science by definition is self-correcting, because if you gather information in January or February of 2020 and that information changes 6 months, a year later, if you're being true to the science, you will use the self-correcting phenomenon of science to be able to make changes, to adjust your recommendations and your guidelines according to the currently available data. Sometimes the general public doesn't fully appreciate that. It's understandable how they might not appreciate that, because they generally think of science as immutable and absolutely absolute. If something is true today, then tomorrow, if something changes, then why are you changing your mind? The way I simply explain it to some people, Pat, is to say that that's the case perhaps with the physical sciences, the mathematical sciences. So, in January of 2020, 2 + 2 = 4. In January of 2025, 2 + 2 still equals 4. But if you look at what we know about COVID now, the variants that have evolved, the capability of the efficiency of its spread, the fact that asymptomatic people can spread the infection, that wasn't fully appreciated in the first few months, or at least the first few weeks of COVID. And things changed in that first 6 months to a year. That understandably confused many people and got them to be skeptical about science.
And as a consequence, well, in general, some of these scientific debates are done within peer-reviewed journals, but you were doing the equivalent with COVID of changing a tire on a moving car.
Right, exactly. And one of the problems that I think we're all very familiar with right now, that we are living in an era, an arena of the rather substantial spread of mis and disinformation, amplified tremendously by social media, that when misinformation gets out there, the general public has a problem of being able to figure out what is true and what is not true, because of the way misinformation and disinformation spread so rapidly through social media.
And this manifests itself in so many ways. One of my doctors was telling me that even though we have the mechanisms now to prevent and care for and cure and mitigate diseases, even terrible catastrophic diseases, that it still hasn't gotten through in some ways. He was telling me about an anti-vaxxed patient of his who wondered whether the doctor himself had been vaxxed. And when the doctor said yes, he said, well, go home and take a refrigerator magnet and rub it on your arm and it'll suck the vaccine out. And so to have this kind of primitive belief in an age when so much information and so much technology and scientific solutions are at our disposal, what do you think accounts for that?
Well, like I said, Pat, I think it's a combination of things, but a lot of it is the spread of mis and disinformation that is so rampant now. I mean, the example you gave can sound ludicrous, but it's true. People were actually accusing Bill Gates and I of putting a chip in the vaccine and so that they could be monitored. And if you look at some people's statements on social media, it's that vaccines kill more people than the disease itself, which when you look at the actual scientific verified data, that people who were vaccinated have a rather extraordinary lesser incidence of getting hospitalization or death. I mean, the charts are really rather dramatic when you look at hospitalization and death among vaccinated people versus unvaccinated people. It sort of hits you like a Mack truck, the data. You can't deny it, but yet people still, because of the spread of misinformation and disinformation, sometimes actually believe that the vaccines cause more harm than the disease, which is absolutely crazy.
As you pointed out in the book, you looked at just some numbers of deaths and serious complications from COVID in more Republican states versus more Democratic states. And the difference was pronounced. And it's kind of alarming because this difference isn't just going to be remedied by better science classes in 8th grade.
Right. Yeah, that is really unfortunate. It's very painful as a physician and a public health person for me to see that people on the basis of political ideology make a decision that has impact on their own health and the health of their family. Political ideology should have nothing to do with good public health principles. Good public health principles are immutable regardless of who you are or what your ideology is. And yet, as you said correctly, that the diminution of numbers of vaccines, relatively speaking, in red states versus blue states led to the phenomenon, which is very unfortunate. And like I said, it's painful to me to see that there were more hospitalizations and deaths among people who live in red states than in blue states. That should never, ever have happened.
And it isn't just COVID that this is now extended to. We see vaccine resistance and skepticism about the immensely contagious and very dangerous measles, for which, of course, there is a vaccine. And the idea that people would say no to things that can save their lives. I remember watching the video of President Eisenhower giving an award to Jonas Salk, the discoverer of the polio vaccine. And President Eisenhower, just was choked up thinking of himself as a grandfather and all the children's lives that would be saved. And you wonder, how did we get from that to this?
Well, that's one of my considerable concerns, Pat, is that the anti-vax feeling that we have in this country now, which is stronger than it's ever been, could lead to a diminution in the acceptance of childhood vaccines such as measles and polio and mumps and pertussis and things like that. And we know historically, whenever there has been a diminution below a certain level of vaccinations for these childhood diseases, you have outbreaks of measles. I mean, there have been some countries that have suspended measles vaccinations temporarily, and you see a significant uptick in serious disease from measles, which is totally avoidable if people get vaccinated.
One more question about the public health system, which is that one of the things we saw kind of laid bare during COVID, or perhaps even created as a consequence of COVID, is that public officials and the public attacked public health figures. I'm not just talking about you, but the local health officials whose data is relied upon by the CDC to pass along information about communicable and contagious diseases. People were hounded out of office, were scared or threatened out of office. What are your concerns about what's going to happen to public health service in this country if this thing persists, if people are disinclined to go into it, not because they're not interested, but because their lives are being threatened?
Well, I think it's a reflection, Pat, of the profound divisiveness in our country. I mean, differences of opinion, diversity is fine in people's opinions about things, but if there ever was an unfortunate time to have an outbreak as serious as COVID, would be at a time when there was a profound degree of divisiveness in the country. And that's what you're seeing. I mean, this backlash against people who are trying to preserve and protect the public health in general and the public health of individuals. I mean, so many of my colleagues were subject to the same sort of pushback that I've experienced personally, but many of my public health colleagues who were doing their best to save lives. It's extraordinary that they are often the object of vitriol against them, which just doesn't make any sense at all.
Are you worried that the people won't go into public health or
Well, yeah, I am.
generally?
I am. I think if you see people in the profession that you're aspiring to enter, that you see the kinds of pushback against them, threats on their family, people who are, in the health field, in emergency rooms and trying to help people wind up being the object of scorn on the part of people. That is a big disincentive to enter the field of medicine, science, and public health. So I'm concerned that that is going to lead to a shortage of the kinds of people you need to respond appropriately to public health challenges.
Well, speaking of intimidation, when we get into the subject of whether or not COVID came from a lab or a wet market origin, you mentioned that you thought some of the Chinese scientists might have felt a little pressured or reluctant to talk about what they actually knew. And I think this was something that you were attacked on by Congress. But what's the difference in whether or not COVID came from a lab or from an animal source?
Well, I mean, in some respects, you want to know how an outbreak started so that you can get a lesson learned about how you can prevent that from happening in the future. So if you say and keep an open mind that it could have come from a lab or it could have come from a natural occurrence, jumping species from an animal to a human in the Wuhan wet market, I must say that there's no definitive evidence either way, but a substantial proportion, in fact, an overwhelming proportion of evolutionary virologists feel strongly that the evidence that we have so far indicates, though it doesn't definitively prove, that this was a naturally occurring outbreak from an animal host to a human, although you have to keep an open mind, since we don't know definitively, that it could have been a lab leak. So the question you ask is, what difference does it make? Is that if it is a lab leak, we've got to make sure that we do things in the future that prevent that from happening again. And if it's from the wet market, which it looks like it is a natural occurrence, even though we don't know for sure, which is the reason why we keep an open mind, then we've got to be careful to make sure that we're very attentive to the animal-human interface, because, in those wet markets, the animals that were in that market were illegally there. They should not have been there. And there's pretty good evidence that those wild animals that were sold for festive feast, when people use it, as kind of a delicacy, that should never have been in the market. And there's pretty good evidence that they broke the rules that they essentially made themselves, and they were there. So what one can do is, regardless of what the origin is, do what you can do to prevent such a thing happening again, either by regulating the markets much more stringently and or being very careful when you work in a laboratory with pathogens that could actually lead to a pandemic.
Hmm. And now we're seeing in the natural world, without presumably the aid of a market, a crossover from bird flu into humans.
Right, exactly, which is what we're concerned about, keeping a real sharp eye on that. You know, H5N1 bird flu has been around for quite a while. The first human cases that I had to deal with were back in 1997 in Hong Kong. And over the years, there has been these infections from bird to human. What's happened now that's worrisome is that it's gotten into mammals like cows, and dairy workers are getting infected from cows who are infected. So we got to make sure we keep an eye on that. The CDC says that and the WHO says that the risk is still relatively low. But when you say it's low, you got to make sure you keep an eye on it and follow it very, very carefully.
One of the matters that has come to the fore is the question of I don't know if you would call them, they're not orphan diseases, but exotic diseases like Ebola, and how people seem to have an outsized fear of a disease, the likelihood of which they're getting is minimal. Some exotic ailment, when of course the real risk to their health is the everyday, every year flu. What do you think there is that accounts for that? That when you said Ebola, and you write about this very compellingly in the book, that yes, it's dangerous, yes, it can kill you, but it's not the risk that the everyday threat is.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, Pat, because that's, as you mentioned, I discussed that in some detail in my memoir, that there was more fear about Ebola spreading in the United States because we were bringing people who were volunteers, Americans who were volunteers, who were over in West Africa, who accidentally got infected. We were taking care of them here. I personally, myself, took care of a couple of them in very strict containment facilities. And there was a concern that that's going to mean we're going to get an outbreak in the United States, when people didn't fully appreciate that in order to spread Ebola, you have to have direct contact with the bodily fluids of a very sick person. So the chances of there being a major Ebola outbreak in the country are essentially zero. Not in West Africa, where the conditions of taking care of people, not anything near what you can have here in the United States. And yet the people were frightened, very much so, that we would have an Ebola outbreak in the United States, which no matter how many times we were telling them that's not going to happen, there was still a lot of fear of that.
So this is where the rational collides with the irrational, and politics stirs the pot.
Indeed, indeed. In fact, that's what we were trying to say, that fear spread more rapidly than Ebola in this country. That's for sure.
You were a friend of Larry Kramer, who was the AIDS activist. And also in your work on COVID, you found that there were what are called comorbidities, that people have other conditions that may make them more vulnerable. And there's always been a lot of debate, and certainly in the last maybe 30 or 40 years, about how one's behavior affects one's health and whether one is acting responsibly about this. For example, with Larry Kramer, he didn't want gay men having indiscriminate, unprotected sex, which made him unpopular and you unpopular for espousing the same. If you're telling people, don't eat processed food all the time, don't eat junk food all the time, rather than these people saying, well, you know, medicine will always fix it, I can always take a pill. Where are our responsibilities as patients?
Yeah. Well, we have a responsibility for providing people with the information of what's good for their health and what's bad for their health. you bring up Larry Kramer, who, was a firebrand activist for HIV, who was actually in some of the earlier books, like the book that he wrote, Faggots, was really a call to the gay community to be very careful following the sexual revolution, because if there was a virus that would be introduced into the population, it could do a great deal of harm. And he was actually, without knowing it, foreshadowing the onset of HIV/AIDS by his warning.
And still people will, it goes back to seatbelts. I don't want to wear a seatbelt even though it might save my life. I want to live on gas station food even though it's not good for me. It, it's one thing to say this is not a good idea, but another one to persuade, and that's maybe where the politics comes in.
Yeah, definitely.
I want to get in a minute to your relationship with President Trump, but there are also some questions from some of the people who are watching you today. Mark says apparently the first Trump administration shut down the pandemic preparedness group and the pandemic, preparedness plan when the pandemic first broke out. What are these protocols that are given, I presume, from president to president, and why would that one have been ignored when it seemed to fit the bill for COVID?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, in the first months of the outbreak, there was a concern that some of the preparedness for pandemics was not implemented as well as it should have been. Regardless of who was in office, this was a very, very serious outbreak. There's no doubt about that. We need to learn the lesson of some of the things that were not done as well as they could have been done. I tend to break the preparedness and response to an outbreak into a scientific bucket and a public health bucket. If you look at the scientific bucket, we in the United States could not have possibly done better. I mean, the idea of getting a vaccine, we started work on the vaccine about 10 days after the sequence was known of what the virus was that was spreading in China. And we had a vaccine tested in tens of thousands of people and shown to be safe and highly effective in preventing severe disease in 11 months from the time the sequence was known. That would have been unimaginable years ago. Generally, vaccines take 7 to 10 years to get developed and proven to be safe and effective. And that capability, which was shown here with Operation Warp Speed and with the science that was done, mostly supported by the National Institutes of Health, probably saved millions of lives. In fact, there were some modeling studies to show that vaccines in a period of a year and a half or two in the United States saved more than 3 million lives, and throughout the world, as many as 14 million lives. So from a scientific standpoint, we did very well. What we didn't do as well was in the public health response. It was a rather fractionated response where you had individual states doing things in a way that was not necessarily optimal to be able to contain the outbreak. And that's what we really need to do for next time, to make sure that we understand the sound public health principles and uniformly implement them.
What is the responsibility of physicians? Scientists may be kind of reluctant to go on stage and talk about their work because they're concerned that it would be misinterpreted, and now they have ample evidence that it can be. But for scientists to be able to explain clearly what it is they're talking about, would that help to deal with some of this misinformation? I mean, some of our viewers, like Joel, saying, how do you get people to trust you and to diminish that misinformation? Scientists have to be good at it, and you are good at it.
Well, first of all, you have to, when you're talking about issues of public health and you're a scientist, you've got to know your audience. So my general rule of communication is, first Know your audience, know who you're speaking to, number one. Number two, try to be as precise and clear as you possibly can without giving multiple versions of things. People can grab a concept that's a single, crisp concept and explain it in a way in clear language that they can understand. And I think we all need to do better with that. I mean, there's always room for improvement. The communication sometimes early on, I must say, was sometimes a little bit garbled for people to really understand. And that's the lesson we've got to learn, that we've got to be much more crisp and clear in our communications.
And not be afraid to communicate.
Oh, absolutely not. I mean, communication, Pat, is such an important thing when you're dealing with a catastrophic situation like an evolving pandemic. In fact, the general public is dependent on clear and honest communication that's based on evidence and facts and data.
Let's talk then about your relationship with presidents and your very good relationship, for example, with George H.W. Bush, and the on tiptoe one you may have had with President Trump in that chapter you call "Love Me, Loves Me, Loves Me Not," over how sometimes he would sound very supportive, and you would be careful not to lay too much on the table so as not to alienate him and cut yourself out. But then he would go and contradict something that you said. So first, what was after serving 7 presidents, what were your operative principles on how you deal with a president?
Well, I'll tell you a very brief story, Pat, that I think will explain that. The first time, and again, I mentioned this in the memoir, I describe it. So, but I can sort of synopsize it for the listeners, that the first time that I went into the White House to brief President Reagan about HIV, a very close confidant and mentor of mine who had been in the White House for several years during the Nixon administration told me something that I would have hoped I would have come to that conclusion anyway. But he fortified it for me. He said, when you walk into the White House and you go under that awning into the lower level of the West Wing, whisper into your own ear that this may be the last time I'm going to come into this building, because I might have to tell the president or the people around the president an inconvenient truth that they may not want to hear, and I might not get asked back again. And there is a tendency, because of the awe-inspiring nature of the White House, of wanting to get asked back. And one of the things you got to be careful, as you don't sugarcoat something or tell somebody something that they may not want to hear because you're afraid of the consequences. And that's what he meant by tell yourself you may not get asked back. I did that with every president that I served, from Reagan to George H.W. Bush, to Clinton, to George W. Bush, to Obama, to Trump, and then to Joe Biden. And for the most part, it really worked, because they will respect you even when you tell them the inconvenient truth. In my situation with President Trump, that we actually had quite a good relationship. I mean, there's a misinterpretation that we didn't have a good relationship. But when he started to say things that just were not true, like the virus would disappear like magic, or that interventions like hydroxychloroquine work and are really going to be perhaps a cure, that I knew that was not the case. And although I have a great deal of respect for the presidency of the United States, and it was very painful for me to speak out publicly and contradict the president, I felt I really needed to be, essentially for my own personal integrity and for my responsibility to the American public. And I did. And that's when things started to clash a bit. But even when he would get upset with me for saying things that were contrary to what he was saying, he never wanted to really, fight with me. And he would say, Tony, what are you doing? What are you saying? And then at the end of it, he'd say, we're still okay, aren't we? I mean, we're good. Which that's the reason why I made the chapter title, Love Me Not, because he would get angry at things, but then at the end of the day, he never really seriously became an enemy of mine, not at all. And I think that's something that is not very well understood by people who think that we're at odds. I had to disagree with some of the things he said, but it was respectfully disagreeing.
It's one thing to take the scientific results coming from a person of science, and then as a person of politics as well and leadership for a president of the United States to take the science into account and then add in the mix politics or image or perception or whatever else is also important. But it doesn't seem like Donald Trump did that very well. You describe an incident where you're telling him, you're telling it like it is, and you think you've finally gotten through to him, and then he goes off on the campaign trail the next day and says COVID is a Democratic hoax.
Yeah.
What must you have felt after investing all of that in the little time I presume you had with him to try to say this is serious and you're in a position to be a leader about it?
Well, I think I can describe it, Pat, as just saying I was disappointed. Yeah, I was. Because understandably, he desperately wanted the outbreak to go away. He just wanted so much for it to go away, but it wasn't going to go away. And we had to essentially address it head on.
He said he wanted it sort of cleared up by Easter, and you said Easter is no respecter, or viruses are no respecter of Easter. And then he would, and you said his teleconferences, governors would tell him what a great job he was doing, but you tried not to flatter him, not to underplay the seriousness, and telling him the country would respect him for being honest on things like masks, when in fact the power of messaging for masks or against them was immense, and he chose the other direction from what you were recommending.
Yeah, and again, Pat, that's what I said was some of the unfortunate thing, because I think that there was a missed opportunity to use the bully pulpit of the presidency to get the country to do the right thing. Because when it became clear that masks were unequivocally recommended, that people should wear masks in indoor settings during the height of the pandemic, he came out and said, well, that's true. They made the recommendation, but I, for one, am not going to wear one. I mean, it would have been so much better if he said, I'm going to wear one. We all should wear one. It would have really gone a long way to get the American public to be in unison about that public health measure.
Some of his comments led you to believe that he was conflating the flu with COVID. Is it possible he just didn't understand the science enough to make a fair judgment?
No, I wouldn't say that. I mean, I want to be fair to him, and I think that would be unfair to him. It isn't that he couldn't understand the difference, is that since they were both respiratory diseases, he was hoping that COVID would act like the flu. And by acting like the flu means that when the warmer weather came, it would essentially go away. We have a flu season every year that goes from the end of November, beginning of December to maybe mid-March, the end of March, and then April comes and it goes away. That's what he was hoping, that COVID would be like flu. And that's why I had to tell him, as well as other people, that no, it's very different from flu.
And before we get to a couple more questions, what about your relationship with Congress, where I think you last appeared in June of last year, your final appearance before your retirement, where they were all but, again, calling for your head. And at one point, you said that if anyone's lying here, you're the one who's lying. And you were addressing that to Rand Paul, who was mischaracterizing not only your point of view, but the science. So what is up with Congress and you?
Well, it's only very, very recently there, and I think as I mentioned a few moments ago, Pat, I believe it's a reflection of the profound divisiveness in the country. I mean, I've been testifying before Congress with every outbreak that has occurred since HIV back in the 80s, and I think it's without hyperbole. I probably have testified before Congress more than anyone else in history.
Well, there's a medal for that, I think.
No, the reason I say that is that, I mean, every time there's an outbreak of something, whether it's anthrax or Ebola, I've testified, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 times. I've been doing it for 38 years as director. If you do the math on that, it's been a few hundred times that I've testified before Congress, at least a couple of hundred times. And there's always been differences of opinion, and there's always been politics associated with it, but only very recently, which you were alluding to just now, was there that profound degree of vitriol and just hostility to public health and science that I saw. I mean, you mentioned the June hearing, when Marjorie Taylor Greene started spouting off things that I didn't have any idea what she was talking about. Yeah, that's unique. That's not the way Congress generally acts towards people, even people for whom they disagree with. This past experience with COVID has been unique, I would say, in all of my experience with the Congress.
Dina has a question about vaccine resistance, which you note in the book, the low numbers of pickup on initial COVID and then the boosters, and lower even than some countries that don't have vaccines readily available as they are here. And Dina's question is, do you think it'll really take like a resurgence of polio or measles or some other terrible disease for anti-vaxxers to change their minds, for people to feel, okay, enough of the noise, let's do the right thing?
Well, I hope it doesn't come to that, because I'd hate to see particularly children suffer, get ill, get seriously ill, and sometimes even die from these diseases, in order for people to realize that, wow, we really got to get people properly vaccinated. Because right now, we don't have any fear of measles or polio or pertussis, because vaccines have essentially eliminated those diseases in this country. It would really be unfortunate that we have to wait for those diseases to come back before people fully realize the importance of vaccines. I mean, I would like them to realize it before we have the issue of the diseases coming back.
I remember when I got my first COVID shot and I cried because I was so relieved. And thanks to Operation Warp Speed, which you give Donald Trump credit for getting that vaccine developed. But I also asked the woman giving me the shot, do you know what that is? And pointed to a dent in my arm. And she said, oh, yes, that's a smallpox vaccine. And so those sorts of things generate memories. But you're right. I think that, until you maybe see someone with polio or understand the consequences, your mind, well, might not be changed. And we have another question from, I think it was Gordon. And this may be a question of perception, that it seems that more infections are transmitted today from animals and fowl than in the past. So is that one of those cases of we know more to recognize it, or is there in fact more of such infections?
Well, we're recognizing it more because of the travel, because of the animal-human interface has been increased over the last many years as we encroach upon the environment. An important fact that people should realize, that at least 75% of all of the new infectious diseases that afflict man are zoonotic, Pat, which means they come from an animal reservoir, they jump species, and they affect men. There's so many examples of that. HIV is a clear one of a jumping of a species from a chimpanzee to a human and then spread among humans. Influenza early on was primarily not a human infection. It was infection of wild birds and fowl, and then into chickens and pigs, and then into humans. So many of those new diseases are what we call zoonotic, that they really are reservoir diseases in animals that jump species to humans.
And one point you make in the book is the testing question that Gordon alluded to was that Donald Trump thought that the more you tested, the more there were cases, and that was not a good idea, as if the testing created the cases. And here again, this is more of a political mindset that, well, let's keep this on the down low a little bit and not let people know how bad it is. And that seems like a fight that doctors shouldn't have to fight.
Right. I mean, as you may remember, Pat, I have always been one for very widespread testing during COVID because, yeah, if you don't test, you don't pick up some of the cases, and therefore you think that the impact is less than what it really is. That's the reason why when you're having the spread of a disease, testing is such an important tool that we need to use.
Carol said she read recently about your idea to have scientists identify and create vaccines for 10 or 12 pathogens most likely to cause outbreaks or pandemics. Whatever became of that? Your unified field theory.
Well, no, it was a prototype pathogen approach that we developed when I was the director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, which is just that, Pat. It's to study intensively a representative prototype pathogen from any of a number of the 7, 8, 9 or so families of viruses that are most likely to result in an outbreak, and to do the basic fundamental research on those pathogens that would be representative of the entire family, so that if you do have an outbreak within that family of viruses, you will be way ahead of the game and you won't have to start from scratch. It's called the prototype pathogen approach to pandemic preparedness.
That sounds like quite an acronym.
Yeah, it is.
Several people have asked if there's any hope for people with long COVID, any remedies, treatments, anything you see.
Well, it's a real phenomenon, long COVID. It's unfortunate that, a fairly large, relatively speaking, 5-6% of the people who have been infected wind up getting long COVID, which is a persistence of a variety of conflicting and very, disturbing symptomatologies that can last for months and even years following COVID. Unfortunately, there's no intervention now that can essentially cure or stop long COVID. But there's a lot of research going on right now to try and figure out what we call the underlying pathogenesis of long COVID is, so that we can do something about it. The bottom line, Pat, is that it's a serious issue that we have to take seriously because of the number of people who are suffering from long COVID.
We started by talking early on about the scientific method and how you learn from your errors. What were the errors you think you made, especially during COVID, when you were front and center and people, in fact, thought you were making COVID policy and not the White House?
Yeah, well, I'm glad you brought that up. I wasn't making COVID policy, even though I'm getting blamed for making COVID
I think
policy.
you needed a button that said "not in charge."
Yeah, not in charge. Well, yeah. So if you start off with, if I had known what I know now back in January, and not just me, but the entire COVID response team, the COVID task force that was formed in the Trump White House, were a group of people who were trying to keep up with this evolving condition, this moving target. If I had known, and all of us had known back then, we may have done things very, very differently. If you want to call those mistakes, then we'll call them mistakes. But if we had known, for example, early on, that the virus was spread easily from people who had no symptoms, there would have been much more emphasis placed on better ventilation and masks much, much earlier on. So if you want to call those mistakes, I guess they're mistakes, but we didn't have the information that was necessary to make the right recommendation at the time.
And also the development of that vaccine was phenomenal because of the platform, the vaccine platform you talked about. Is that promising for other diseases?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, it's a very adaptable platform, the mRNA technology. And already there have been a number of studies using it for other diseases, HIV, malaria, even for some cancer vaccines, it's being used. It's a quite promising technology.
Our viewer Bruce wants to know whether you recommend everyone to get the RSV vaccine. Obviously, you can't diagnose everybody and give everybody contraindications, but in general.
No, not everyone. I don't think that a healthy 25-year-old person necessarily needs it, but certainly it's recommended for elderly people over a certain age, because the very young children and elderly are the ones that would get serious disease more likely than anyone else. So it's very unlikely that a healthy 30-year-old person who gets RSV is going to get a serious involvement with that infection.
I know that you said you're not going to talk about prospective Trump administration policies or personnel, but in 2017, you and Dr. Francis Collins, the head of the NIH, who I had some wonderful interviews with in years past, had met with RFK Jr. and heard about his attitude toward vaccines. Can you tell us about that meeting?
I think that we'll get into my
I'm just
comment.
asking about what's in the book.
No, I mean, he clearly felt strongly that vaccines, particularly measles, was responsible for autism, even though the overwhelming evidence indicates that that's not the case. And anything that Dr. Collins and I could tell him did not dissuade him from that.
Martin wants to know, would there be a dangerous environmental downside to a successful malaria vaccine? This reminds me of the Chinese "Let's kill all the sparrows" campaign, and then what happened to
No.
locust
I mean, a
fever.
malaria vaccine would, I mean, you're having like 600,000 deaths per year, mostly in African children from malaria. Goodness, we do have some promising leads for malaria vaccines already, particularly over the last 4 or 5 years. We have done very well. We can still do better, but I would wish that we would have a 100% durable and protective vaccine for malaria that lasts for an indefinite period of time. It's such a tragedy that so many children, particularly in Southern Africa, die of malaria each year.
Well, I'm sure this is a question you've gotten from Congress many times before, especially on the Zika virus when you were trying to get funding for a vaccine. And that was essentially, why are we spending money on people who aren't Americans? Why are we doing all this stuff overseas for them?
Yeah. Well, you know my answer, Pat, but I'll articulate it. You know, the United States is the richest country in the world. We have the best science. We have the best capabilities of developing these kinds of interventions. And I actually feel that we have somewhat of a moral responsibility because we have the capability of developing interventions that could be life-saving for people, even though these people don't live in the United States, which is the reason why President George W. Bush started the President's Malaria Initiative, and why I had the honor and the privilege of working with George W. Bush to develop and put together the PEPFAR program, the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, that was directed specifically to prevent, treat, and care for HIV in the developing world, particularly sub-Saharan Africa. And that program has already saved 25 million lives. So only the United States could have done that because of our wealth and our expertise. And I think, as I mentioned, that we have a responsibility to the rest of the world to do that if we can. And we've done it with diseases like HIV and PEPFAR and malaria.
Are there any structural changes in the NIH umbrella that you think would help to make relations with Congress better, to explain better, to make them less fraught and more informative?
Well, I hope that the NIH gets the opportunity, you know, with the Congress and with the new administration to articulate the things that the NIH has done and is capable of doing. It's an extraordinary organization, Pat. I mean, the research that comes out of the NIH has been responsible, you know, for the development of most of the drugs that we use that cure diseases, that treat diseases. And all of the things that come out of that is the science base that is essential to keep us healthy. So it is just an extraordinary organization that needs to continue to be supported.
How are you enjoying retirement? You look like you're very retired with that professor backdrop there.
No, I'm not. I mean, I've certainly retired from the NIH, but I'm now on the faculty as a distinguished university professor at Georgetown with a dual appointment in the School of Medicine and the McCourt School of Public Policy. So I'm really quite busy. lecturing and doing fireside chats and meeting with students and making rounds on patients. So I'm pretty busy.
I thought you were going to say the School of Hard Knocks.
Yeah.
I think everybody gets a degree from that. So before we wrap up with, we usually ask people to give us an optimistic minute, but questions that have come across the transom, and one that I wonder too, because there have been so many threats against you, not just by ordinary citizens, but by people in a position of authority, members of Congress. Would you accept a preemptive pardon from President Biden if it were offered to spare you what they might do?
I'm sorry, Pat, but I can't comment on that. That's just too sensitive an issue. I apologize.
I understand. So why don't you give us then some hopeful things to look forward to anticipate as we enter a new phase of the public health system in this country?
Yeah. Well, being a scientist and a physician and a public health person, I can comment in the lane in which I'm familiar. And my hope is that the scientific opportunities that we have now, and that if we continue to support basic and clinical research, those opportunities will do anything and they will expand greatly. So my hope is that as we look forward, the investment in basic and clinical research will lead to cures of diseases that at this point are still incurable, the alleviation of suffering from diseases that people get and have, a very difficult time with, even though it may not be lethal. I have a great deal of faith in the power of science and the applicability of science to bettering the health of people, not only in this country, but throughout the world. So to me, that's a very positive looking towards the future, because I think we can do that.
And do you have faith in the American political system that it can still deliver that?
It may sound somewhat optimistic in the sense, or maybe naive, and I don't think I'm naive, but I feel that the better angels in the people in this country will prevail when all of this divisiveness gets sorted out. And I think when we start to realize, all of us, that we're so much more alike than we are different, that the profound divisiveness that I saw tearing apart the country during the COVID outbreak will essentially dissipate and go away. I have an abiding faith that things will get better.
Without, as one of our viewers asked, there having to be some devastating public health crisis that will propel people into the proper frame of mind, shall we call it?
Yeah, I hope so, and I think so.
Well, Dr. Anthony Fauci, it has been such a pleasure to talk to you. I talked to you some years ago about, I think it was Zika on my radio program, but it's great to catch up and find out all the things. Well, it's not like we don't know what you've been doing in the interim because you've been doing them on television. So we thank you very much. His book is On Call, A Doctor's Journey in Public Service. Thank you so much. I hope you will join us again sometime.
Thank you for having me, Pat. I really appreciate it. Thanks a lot.
Thanks to Dr. Fauci, and of course to all of you for watching these informative series. You can find more about what's coming up next. I've got Dennis Ross coming up on January 15th about the Israel and Crisis briefing. And then 2 days after the inauguration, Jeffrey Goldberg talking with Madeline Brand about Inauguration Week. Where are we headed? And we plunge then into the new year thereafter. Thanks to all of the sponsors and the people who support these programs, which have been so vital in keeping us connected to what's going on in our world and our country and in our backyards. And sometimes they're a little more difficult than other days. This has been one, so we are especially grateful to all of you for joining us. Thank you very much. I'm Patt Morrison. Stick around, look what's coming up, and join us for those as well.